tahia whakaritia te pai wānanga o rā koutou matua mō ngā aumangia. Welcome to Mata with me, Mihingarangi Forbes, brought to you by Te Māngai, Pāho and Irirangi Te Motu, New Zealand on Air. Shane Jones is the Minister for Regional Development, Resources and all things tangaroa, as well as a self-described hitman in the war on woke. He says he's sick to death of hearing about genderism, climatism, wokeism, and if that's not a mission statement, we don't know what is. A retail politician with poetic swag and a nose for populist pressure points, Jones is right in the thick of it, from railing against co-governance in the Waitākere Ranges to backing a bill that seeks to define what a wahine is. Noku te maringa nui kua tau mai tēnei kuaka tātā ki o te nota ki te taiwhanga pāpāho nei. Nau mai e te minita e Shane, tēnā koe.
Kia ora, tēnā tātou.
Submissions closed on Monday on how to implement the Waitākere Ranges Heritage Area Acts Management Plan. You've had plenty to say on the Waitākere Ranges, how it should and shouldn't be managed. The deed includes council, crown and iwi. What's the problem with having iwi there?
Actually, I was involved in 2008 when that legislation was passed. Mm-hmm. And the legislation correctly enables Te Kawerau Maki, or as I colloquially call them, the Maki people, and Ngāti Whātua to have historic associations and whatnot identified, which is not a bad idea. And I suppose I was a bit annoyed too with the Kawerau Maki CEO. The only two politicians who stood up for this tribe were Winston and I when they had their deal with Fletchers to build houses at Ihumātao. And they were pilloried. And Wārena Taua, sadly, was marginalised by the politics of that time. But Winston and I, to the bitter end, stood up for them. And the revenue and the opportunities that that deal would have given Te Kawerau Maki are much larger than they got from their settlement. So now they are still trying to create a marae at Bethel's Beach, which is all kāpai. But the thing that made me allergic is that I don't accept that the way for them, or for any Māori group, to imprint further their influence over 27,000 hectares, a third of which is privately owned, is by setting up yet another council committee. That council committee, in my view, will never be set up. And that's quite different than what the law intended, because I was in Parliament and was one of the people who voted for that law. We never, ever imagined, Mihi, that that law would morph into the creation of a committee where co-sovereignty would be shared over 27,000 hectares.
What they're asking for is a seat at the table with the other two authorities, the Crown and the Council, so that they can have some say around what they call is their heartland.
Yeah,
the
their mana
Waitākere.
whenua.
Yeah. What's wrong with that?
I don't think that that's really what they're on about.
That's exactly what Edward Ashby is saying.
Let's just agree to disagree, you and I. If you read their documentation, their agenda is to substantially close down access to a large part of that reserve on the basis that it might save the Kauri trees. And this is my point. These things...
But isn't that what management is about? Is that being able to protect a species which might be under threat, like Kauri dieback, how the government and the Crown and iwi got involved in those kinds of kaupapa?
The Kauri dieback experience has been a disaster. Money has been squandered, common sense went out the door, and what the Kawerau Maki are proposing has a lot of merit. But where I will never ever agree, or New Zealand First won't, is that should morph into them being a stakeholder and that growing to having 50% of either managerial governance authority over 27,000 hectares. It's just never going to happen.
Where did you read 50%?
Because if you look at one of the options that has been out through the Super City Council, a co-governance committee who had 25% DOC, Lord knows how that even came to be, 25% council and 50% tangata whenua.
You did support this. You did support the deed, though, in 2008. And in your speech, you said, in the future, our mokopuna will remember that our MPs, supported by 3 councils, have put in to produce a vision and a plan that will protect the valleys, the gullies, the trees, the creatures throughout the Waitākere Ranges. Mm-hmm. Isn't this exactly what they're trying to do?
Yeah, I'm not denying anyone's interest, whether they're tangata whenua, a runner, a tramper, a hunter, standing up for that massive jewel. But don't forget, that jewel was created to mark the 100th birthday of Auckland. More recently, it provides an opportunity for marginalised tangata whenua groups to re-engage. But we're just never going to tolerate, Mihi, a committee that's got 50% of the authority to one small group that's a private group.
What is your definition of co-governance then? Because you keep calling it co-governance. No one else is calling it co-governance. You are. Edward Ashby, who is the CE of Kawerau Maki, says that you're up to mischief. You're spreading misinformation and you're scaremongering using terms like that.
Well, he's got a point that I'm a politician and I'm entitled to interpret what I see that option. And I actually think it's bad for tangata whenua politics as well. You know, there's a deeper point here. Where do you derive legitimacy from when you're dealing with who should exercise control? Okay, you can argue it should be derived purely from a Māori interpretation of the treaty. That's the Māori Party view. Or you could say, well, it should be moderated by the treaty settlements, and in some cases it might be. Well, the party I belong to, rightfully or wrongfully, we put our lives on hold and we throw 100% of our ability to hold power to the will of the electorate.
This coalition that you're a part of has made it clear it is supportive of historical treaty settlements. This deed acknowledges the historic connection Te Kawerau Maki and Ngāti Whātua have to the Waitākere Ranges. Are you now pushing back on that coalition commitment to historic claims, to deals that are done?
Yeah, we're getting a bit technical here, but the statutory authority for what you just articulated comes from a 2008 piece of legislation that was not a treaty settlement.
But recognises their place.
It was not a treaty settlement. 2008, there was no Kawerau Maki in 2008 with a treaty settlement. All of those settlements emerged when Doug Graham had his master plan to get all of the shards of Māoridom who have mana whenua interests in Auckland together. That's where that came from.
And these arrangements are designed so there are not future breaches of the treaty.
Yeah, and I think that the best way to do that is to avoid a situation where control leads to polarisation and alienation. And look, I know that people find in Māoridom often what I'm saying to be awkward and jarring, so meet me at the ballot box. That's what we campaigned on.
I mean, just on what you said there about the polarisation, we're talking about this idea that there's co-governance because you're saying it's 25% council, 25% Crown and 50% iwi. Yep. No one else is saying that. You're saying that. They're just saying they want to have a round table where they're part of it. In order to have any governance, you have to have power and you have to have resource. Kawerau Maki, Ngāti Whātua do not have the resources of the taxpayer dollar or the ratepayer. They don't have ratepayers and taxpayers, contributing to their administration like the Auckland Council or like government. Yeah. So you can barely say that they're having any co-governance.
No, I think you're right. There will not be co-governance because I've highlighted it. I've made the argument in front of people that do accept that the Maki people, Ngāti Whātua, and the various parts of Ngāti Whātua who have historic associations in that rohe, then that can happen, but it will not be happening through a 50-50 committee.
Do you have the power through a private member's bill to overturn this?
No, what I think that will take place is that when the council looks at the various options, and I'll bet you a vast majority of the councils do want respect shown to Kawerau Maki and their ideas as to how the forest should be managed, but it's just ludicrous that the best thing you can come up with is a 50-50 committee. It's just not going to happen.
Let's talk about mining, and another interest of yours. Can I go back to that same speech, 2008, around the Waitākere Ranges? Because you said, we will not see creeping, encroaching, ill-conceived developments into the area that are irreplaceable. 17 years on, you've launched an ambitious goal of doubling mineral exports to 3 billion by 2035 in land that I imagine isn't irreplaceable. Which minerals will get the most traction, do you think? Gold, coal? What are you banking on?
Well, I don't think there's a minerals licence that's been allocated over the Waitākere Ranges. However, you rightfully identify there are some blocks of dockland, whare ki Raupunga, down in Waihi, and there's literally mountains of gold under that land. And the tricky bit is if we don't sustain a gold industry, which is often where we find the rare earth minerals, including antimony, then we're not going to keep the human capital, we're not going to maintain the technology. And, politics is not static, it's dynamic. And the political situation we find ourselves now in New Zealand is that we do need to generate more wealth and we need to use these resources. And I accept that my view is regarded as a minority view amongst iwi on the extractive sector, but that's because I think I'm ahead of most where people are. I never get ahead of myself, but I'm ahead of where my critics are, because so many of our people working in this industry are in Australia, and they would come back in a nanosecond.
It's interesting because you talked about Waihi, and I'm from the Hauraki, and so I know a little bit about that place, and it's pretty poor there. The average. They're probably below the average household income, and we had a coal mine that was kohard or gifted or tuku whenua or whatever it was back in the day by two rangatira from Ngāti Maru, Tamatera.
Yeah.
It's not really worked out for them.
So I'd encourage our listeners to study the population of Waihi. When you've got a large percentage of the people living there on fixed income, it always skews. It skews the household status. So I don't pay much attention to that criticism.
Oh, I'm talking about, the awa that was created for the boats to come in and Pairo, Ngātia, all around there.
Where you and I disagree, I suspect, is that I'm not captivated. I'm not a captive of history. And New Zealand does not have a perfect history.
But isn't it a good example to look at history to learn how to do better?
And I think the mining sector are a classic example of where their social licence has grown. And admittedly, it's difficult to remember a politician who's perhaps has been as hyperbolic as I am about mining, but that's political rhetoric. You need to do that to swing the pendulum.
You're the best hype man for mining, there's no doubt. You talked about all of that gold in Waihi, and my understanding is that we've heard in the last 12 months that it's probably the biggest gold discovery in decades. But there's a big difference between estimated resource and mineable resource. Realistically, how much of that would eventuate? Yeah,
that's a good point. Well, all I can do is report on the technical info I'm given, that they are seeking to create a 6-kilometre tunnel under land that is largely, but not exclusively, dock-owned. I've flown over it. The whare ki Raupunga was originally cut and prepared as a forestry block in the late 70s. That never went ahead. There's a lot of scrub and regenerating bush on it. And when you're mining a couple of 100 metres under the earth, there's relatively small spillover effects. I don't accept the catastrophisation. It's got that absurd mihi that I'm told that the detonations under the earth may create quivering and trembling, which will interfere with the mating habits of the frog. Well, if that's the best that can be served up against me, I know I've won the debate. Well, let's look at Stockton Mine on the west coast then, because it produces roughly 80% of coal. At the moment, more money is being spent each year by the taxpayer treating the damages that it collects than it collects in coal royalties. You've just pledged another 50 million, I think, in February. I read a press release. Mm-hmm. Is your regulatory framework strong enough to make sure that we don't end up with another massive bill at the next coal party? Yeah, I think it is, I do accept, however, that that's an ongoing liability and there are lessons to be learnt there. But I just want my critics to know, never mind how loudly and what megaphone is deployed to remind everyone about the downside, I'm not going to be dissuaded. I've got a mandate from the electorate through the election to boost the footprint of mining in New Zealand for jobs, so we're less dependent on Indonesian coal, we're less dependent on importing rare earth minerals if we've got them ourselves. And I know I sound a bit trite when I say it, but meet me at the ballot box.
Well, on the ballot box thing, because I keep hearing that you've got a mandate, and when you consider what New Zealand First got at the elections, it's not really a mandate, it's 8%.
But when you create a coalition government, then the whole is larger than the constituent parts.
But in terms of what you were talking about prior to the election, you couldn't guarantee that all of anyone who voted for National Act and New Zealand First was pro-mining.
But what I can say is that when the three parties sought to formalise an arrangement to enjoy the privilege of power in Parliament, then each party brought forward what it represented to the electorate. And yes, there are those who say, oh, you fellas only got 6.5%, so you're exaggerating. Study the coalition agreement. We live by the words written in that agreement.
Can I just come back to the regulatory framework that you say is strong enough so we don't create another mess? I remember I actually interviewed you last year on the Kawerau story, and you said we can't hold private companies accountable. It just wouldn't work. So what is the strength of your regulatory framework which would now hold them accountable?
No, when you receive a resource consent or a mining permit, there are conditions associated with that. And if you don't abide by those conditions, then there are statutory remedies. I'm pretty sure that what I referred to is that the historic destruction of that river and all that, which is reflective of what was happening in New Zealand's attempt to industrialise way back then. Many years on, those private companies don't even exist in the form that they did.
Exactly.
And I'm just about to finish. And this in this current regime, you can't judge historically what took place and then insist that exactly the same thing is going to happen when we've got better technology, more sophisticated training, and Mother Nature still has the same challenges. But you see, I just don't buy into this catastrophisation of historical events as paving the way for the future. In fact, I call that woke.
What is woke?
I was so happy that you were going to ask me that question. But
You were prepared for it. Tell me.
No.
What's your vision of woke?
Let's have a wee discussion about it. I'm the first to admit that woke is now an ideological term. Woke is also, depending where you sit ideologically, either from a fictionary or a dictionary. You and I both know this. But when I use the term woke, I'm referring to excessive bouts of political correctness, excessive attempts to impose values without a democratic mandate on society without the necessary political, quite frankly, could be a moral debate. I see it in mining all the time. There's this ideology that seeks to cancel out the narrative to do with mining because it represents a mortal threat to every frog, every bat. And I dismiss that as woke excessiveness, exaggerating what's happened in the past as being the only outcome that will happen tomorrow.
Was that Shane Jones from Te Kawariki? Were you woke back in the day?
Well, in the Bible it says when I was a child, I thought as a child.
You were an adult.
Now, just bear with me. No phase of a person's life is wasted. And the phase that I went through as a young 20-odd-year-old, it's what's made me who I am today. But when we were running our arguments in our 20-year-olds, there were people on the other side of the road running countervailing arguments. They were often my own kaumatua. And I've just morphed into a figure that is willing to debate things that make sense at this particular time. I reckon that we've gone through the heyday of treaty settlements. I'd like to think I played a small role in the 1980s or 70s driving that. But we've now got to get into economic empowerment. And we mustn't hobble ourselves by catastrophic stories.
So you were like a child, and then in your 20s you were woke, to your description of it, or an activist at least for Te Kawariki. And then in 2008, just in this interview alone, looked like you were anti-mining. And 17 years later, you're the champion of mining.
Yeah.
What are you going to be in the next 15 years?
I don't think you should say that I was ever anti-mining, because I came from the fishing industry, arguably, which
You're a
is
pro-climate.
just is.
You're a pro the birds and the trees and the gullies.
But I still am. But I'm just saying we need to be balanced. And I just feel that a lot of what's happened with our narratives, Mihi, we've become so unbalanced. And even in Māoridom, if you're seen as being on the side of extraction or too pro-development, then the political climate is such that you're selling out the kaupapa. Now, fortunately, I like fighting. So I'm always up for that debate. It can be time-wasting, and that's a criticism that's been put to me, that I spend too much time fighting imaginary forces. But I must say I treat it as a bit of a tonic.
Yeah, Can I talk about this next fight then? Because there's been a bit of a fight going on. Your leader, Winston Peters, has had a lot to say about us lately, wahine. He says it's not about being anti-anyone or anti-anything. This is about ensuring we as a country focus on the facts of biology and protect the term woman in law. Shania Twain says you're a woman if you feel like you're a woman, but nonetheless you want to make a determination. Why?
Well, once again, we're going back to a bedrock position that our party campaigned on. Now, when we are born with certain biological features. You and I both know that. But then some people go through their lives and they develop a sense of who they are and want to embrace certain gender characteristics. But what Winston has laid out is what we campaigned on, that we are going to have a very clear and arguable position that will go through a select committee. So all of these sort of foolish questions that he had to sustain from your colleague, Mr. Dan, will that be a biological test? We'll sort all those details out in the select committee.
Well, I guess people want to know now because they want to know what it's going to be like for them. But again, why? Why do you have to determine what a biological woman or a biological man is? What's the motivation
I
or
would
the
direct
point?
your listeners to read the Supreme Court decision of the UK. Now, we arrived at that conclusion a long time before the Supreme Court. That was always our position. Now, you're saying, well, why are you wasting...
Is it about the rights of biological women?
I know, once again, people will have the chance through the select committee to come and have their say. I know it's a hotly contested issue.
No, I'm just wondering, why do we have to determine? Is the motivation because you want to protect the rights of women who are biologically female?
Yeah, well, a host of people made submissions, made entreaties and approaches to the party. They felt that their womanhood, their wahinetanga, was being compromised, misrepresented and distorted by the gender debate. Okay? And nowhere was that more evident than when Rosie sought to speak near the Auckland University. So we took this issue to the New Zealand public. And I accept a lot of people disagree with us, but that's how democracy works. And then everyone can have their say once it goes to the select committee.
So let's talk about the rights of women, because there's 2.6 million wahine in Aotearoa and they earn 8.2% less than men. And for wahine Māori, it's 15% less.
Right.
Where's the plan to tackle that inequity?
Well, before you have a plan for any subset, you need a plan to generate greater returns, greater momentum, and greater surpluses in an economy. And you can't do it just for one subset, although they may be suffering inequity. That's why we're driven to do further deregulation. That's why we're driven to open up sectors of the economy that have historically been cancelled. And unless we have that, Mihi, we're not going to have the surplus to fund whether it's Māori women,
you haven't got a
Pākehā
plan.
women.
You haven't got a plan to close the gap of inequity for wahine and men in employment, but you're rushing through this plan, this bill, this legislation. What's the plan for the 10,000 trans people in New Zealand when you make this determination?
Well,
or the 100,000 intersex people?
Yeah, so they can pop along to the select committee and they can have their say.
Well, how will you protect them?
No, they can come to the select committee. See, this is how democracy works. You put out a platform, you campaign on it, then you provide an opportunity through Parliament for people to have their say. And they mustn't exaggerate their situation. I know many in that community, and not all of them speak with the same voice as that young fella in the Green Party, Doyle. So this is why you have an open process and people can go to the select committee and have their say.
E te minita tēnā koe, i te whakarongo koutou, kia Shane Jones. Thank you for your time.
Kia ora, tēnā tātou.
Mai i te mata o te arero, ki te pito o taringa are, kua tutuki ngā wānanga o te wā, kua ea. Tēnei te mihi ki te Māngai Pāho me irirangi te motu, nā rawa tēnei hōtaka i tautoko. We'll be back with more mata in a fortnight. No horo mai.